To be true to one's own freedom is, in essence, to honor and respect the freedom of all others. Dwight D. Eisenhower.
Oh, hi! Mr. Lahaski here, and today we'll look at American society in the 1950s. In the immediate aftermath of World War II, the United States slipped into a Cold War with the Soviet Union. The two superpowers featured political and economic worldviews that were mutually exclusive of one another. The struggle between them bred volatility that lasted for decades, and it's hard to overstate the effect that the Cold War had on American life, especially in the 1950s. Today, we'll look at those effects. First, a big question. Which poses a greater threat to American democracy? Radical ideology or the fear of it? Popular culture tells us that the 1950s proved to be a great struggle between democratic and communist forces, that espionage was rampant, and that the world teetered on the brink of a nuclear holocaust. And elements of this version of history are certainly true. But the early decades of the Cold War also brought on suspicion and paranoia. And as we'll see today, that paranoia sometimes led to action many would consider contradictory to the freedoms we hold dear. So, who was the bigger threat to American democracy in the 1950s? Was it the Russians, or was it ourselves? Let's take a look. The 1950s economy, much like that of the 1920s, benefited from the wartime industrial boom. This is our first big idea. Having fully recovered from the Great Depression, the American economy boomed during the 1950s. Consumerism returned, the middle class grew larger and more prosperous, and a number of government programs provided direct economic support to the American people. Americans achieved a quality of life in the 1950s that no other country could approach. Factories that had played a major role in the Allied war effort were reconverted to produce consumer goods after World War II, and the Depression and wartime rationing had created incredible pent-up demand. Unemployment shrank to less than 5%, and the buying power of the average American family increased by 30% during the decade alone. Like the 20s, the 1950s was a decade of consumerism and consumption. The United States had only 6% of the world's population in the 50s, but Americans consumed nearly a third of the world's goods and services. The middle class grew during the 50s, and the automobile industry changed life in fundamental ways. Cars were affordable commodities for middle-class families, and the number of cars on the road doubled between 1950 and 1958. Access to transportation changed residential patterns as well. Suburbs emerged on the outskirts of cities, based on the model of William J. Levitt. Suburban housing was mass-produced, rendering the homes cost-effective and affordable. Home ownership skyrocketed during the 50s, and the modern notion of the American dream, a 3-bedroom house with a white picket fence, was born. The federal government also played a continued role in the American economy. While some of the New Deal programs faded away as they were no longer needed, others were expanded. For example, in 1953, President Dwight Eisenhower called for an expansion of Social Security to cover 10 million more Americans. Eisenhower also turned to new public works programs. His interstate highway system was the largest public spending project in the nation's history, and it created thousands of jobs across the country. Thanks to the GI Bill, passed near the end of the war, the federal government also provided direct assistance to thousands of World War II veterans in the 50s, who could receive funds for education, housing, and more. Now, we should note that, as was the case in the 1920s, not everyone had access to the shiny new economy of the 1950s. African Americans continued to face economic discrimination. As white Americans were building wealth through home ownership in the suburbs, African Americans were largely left behind in neglected urban apartments. Banks systematically denied home loans to people of color, and a zoning practice called redlining prohibited Black people from living in white suburban neighborhoods. White residents in remote areas like Appalachia were also ignored by the new economy, and poverty amid plenty was one of the great paradoxes of the 1950s. But despite all this, it seemed that things were looking up for the average American, at least economically speaking. Other aspects of American life were certainly darker. This is our second big idea. The Cold War dominated American life in the 1950s, giving rise to a second Red Scare. As I mentioned in the intro, it's hard to overstate the effects of the Cold War on American life. Eisenhower supported the construction of the interstate highway system, at least in part, to allow for evacuations of major cities in the event of a nuclear attack. School children practiced duck and cover air raid drills the way we practice fire drills today. And around every turn, Americans tried to distance themselves from the Soviets. Americans embraced abstract art because it represented creativity, self-expression, and intellectual freedom, elements assumed to be lacking in a communist society. Jazz music remained popular into the 50s for the same reason. And the Pledge of Allegiance was even amended to include the words "under God," as the Soviet government was making strides to eliminate religion in the country. But the number one manifestation of the Cold War in American life was fear. The 1950s witnessed a second Red Scare, a wave of hysteria over the prospect of a communist revolution here at home. And unlike the Red Scare of the 20s, the 1950s featured the added prospect of nuclear war. Much of the Red Scare of the 1950s was centered around the belief that the United States and its government were being infiltrated by Soviet spies. And to be sure, Soviet espionage did occur. In 1950, a German scientist who worked on the Manhattan Project was arrested for supplying the Soviet Union with blueprints of the first American nuclear bombs, possibly accelerating their development of such a weapon. In the same year, Alger Hiss, a former State Department official, was convicted of perjury after admitting to have spied for the Soviets in the 1930s. But the most famous case was Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, a married couple from Manhattan who were arrested and executed for supplying the Soviet Union with nuclear secrets. The Rosenbergs' case shook many Americans. They were, after all, American citizens who had been working to subvert American democracy on American soil. Now, scholars note that the Rosenbergs were small players in the Soviet chain of command, but their arrest touched a nerve, and hysteria over Soviet espionage quickly spun out of control. In February 1950, Wisconsin Senator Joseph McCarthy claimed, without evidence, that more than 200 State Department officials were secretly members of the Communist Party. McCarthy's witch hunt accelerated, and the hysteria around communist infiltration empowered the demagogue. Take a look.
Imagine that one day you're summoned before a government panel. Even though you haven't committed any crime or been formally charged with one, you are repeatedly questioned about your political views, accused of disloyalty, and asked to incriminate your friends and associates. If you don't cooperate, you risk jail or losing your job. This is exactly what happened in the United States in the 1950s as part of a campaign to expose suspected communists. Named after its most notorious practitioner, the phenomenon known as McCarthyism destroyed thousands of lives and careers. For over a decade, American political leaders trampled democratic freedoms in the name of protecting them. During the 1930s and 1940s, there had been an active but small communist party in the United States. Its record was mixed. While it played crucial roles in wider progressive struggles for labor and civil rights, it also supported the Soviet Union. From the start, the American Communist Party faced attacks from conservatives and business leaders, as well as from liberals who criticized its ties to the oppressive Soviet regime. During World War II, when the USA and USSR were allied against Hitler, some American communists actually spied for the Russians. When the Cold War escalated and this espionage became known, domestic communism came to be seen as a threat to national security. But the attempt to eliminate that threat soon turned into the longest-lasting and most widespread episode of political repression in American history. Spurred on by a network of bureaucrats, politicians, journalists, and businessmen, the campaign wildly exaggerated the danger of communist subversion. The people behind it harassed anyone suspected of holding left-of-center political views or associating with those who did. If you hung modern art on your walls, had a multiracial social circle, or signed petitions against nuclear weapons, you might just have been a communist. Starting in the late 1940s, FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover used the resources of his agency to hunt down such supposed communists and eliminate them from any position of influence within American society. and the narrow criteria that Hoover and his allies used to screen federal employees spread to the rest of the country. Soon, Hollywood studios, universities, car manufacturers, and thousands of other public and private employers were imposing the same political tests on the men and women who worked for them. Meanwhile, Congress conducted its own witch hunt, subpoenaing hundreds of people to testify before investigative bodies like the House Un-American Activities Committee. If they refused to cooperate, they could be jailed for contempt, or, more commonly, fired and blacklisted. Ambitious politicians like Richard Nixon and Joseph McCarthy used such hearings as a partisan weapon, accusing Democrats of being soft on communism and deliberately losing China to the communist bloc. McCarthy, a Republican senator from Wisconsin, became notorious by flaunting ever-changing lists of alleged communists within the State Department. Egged on by other politicians, he continued to make outrageous accusations while distorting or fabricating evidence. Many citizens reviled McCarthy, while others praised him. And when the Korean War broke out, McCarthy seemed vindicated. Once he became chair of the Senate's Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations in 1953, McCarthy's recklessness increased. It was his investigation of the Army that finally turned public opinion against him and diminished his power. McCarthy's colleagues in the Senate censured him, and he died less than 3 years later, probably from alcoholism. McCarthyism ended as well. It had ruined hundreds, if not thousands, of lives and drastically narrowed the American political spectrum. Its damage to democratic institutions would be long-lasting. In all likelihood, there were both Democrats and Republicans who knew that the anti-communist purges were deeply unjust, but feared that directly opposing them would hurt their careers. Even the Supreme Court failed to stop the witch hunt, condoning serious violations of constitutional rights in the name of national security. Was domestic communism an actual threat to the American government? Perhaps, though a small one. But the reaction to it was so extreme that it caused far more damage than the threat itself. And if new demagogues appeared in uncertain times to attack unpopular minorities in the name of patriotism, could it all happen again?
McCarthyism featured prominently in the 1950s, but the Red Scare wasn't limited to one rogue senator and the worst impulses of the American populace. In the House of Representatives, the Un-American Activities Committee launched investigations into a variety of industries, most famously Hollywood filmmakers. Often, just being subpoenaed to appear in front of the HUAC was enough for a person to get blacklisted or barred from future employment across their industry. The courts, too, were swept up in the hysteria. In 1951, the Supreme Court ruled in Dennis v. United States that communist gatherings presented a clear and present danger to the U.S., and that communist First Amendment rights to the freedom of speech and assembly could be restricted by the federal government. Indeed, paranoia over communism was evident in every level of government, but it was also clear in civilian life. The 1950s was defined by conformity. Suburbia was lined with row after row of identical houses. Men's and women's fashion settled into modest, predictable styles. Children were taught uniform decorum for interacting with adults, peers, and members of the opposite sex. Here, let me show you what I mean.
Many teenagers are as concerned as their parents with the public's conception of today's youth. These students are portraying what we consider bad taste in school attire and behavior. This student is wearing an ankle bracelet, dungarees, and dropped earrings. This student is wearing an extremely tight skirt and tight sweater. Open shirt, black jacket, dungarees are mentioned in the code as not proper school attire. This group is our ideal of the proper school attire and social behaviors of the Hicksville Junior High students.
These boys greet their dad as though they are genuinely glad to see him, as though they had really missed being away from him during the day and are anxious to talk to him. This is the time for pleasant discussion in a thoroughly relaxed mood. They don't pick this time of the day to spring unpleasant surprises on Dad.
Oh, I'm so happy. I could be a model. Or a cover girl.
Hey, what's gotten into that crazy kid's sister?
Oh, Jeff, don't be that way.
Notice how Mother seems to become angry herself because of Jeff's anger. Perhaps she shouldn't, but anger is a violent emotion, and we often see an induction of behavior or spread of emotion to other persons, almost like a contagious disease.
Yoo-hoo!
Jenny thinks that she has the key to popularity, parking in cars with the boys at night. When Jerry brags about taking Jenny out, he learns that she dates all the boys. What about Jenny? Does that make her really popular? Do the boys and girls like her? Is she welcome to join this group?
Hi, Betty, Ellie. You can rest your tray here, Jenny, for a minute. Thanks. Say, Wally, how's the play coming along?
Oh, okay, Jenny. Here, Jenny.
No,
Thanks,
girls
Jerry.
who park in cars are not really popular. Not even with the boys they park with. Not when they meet at school or elsewhere.
Nothing like being Miss Popularity. Yeah.
Eileen, this is Steve.
Hello, Steve.
Hello, Eileen. Aren't you the party planner I've heard so much about?
Well, and this is Paul Johnson, our star tackle.
How you doing, Steve? Glad to know you, Paul. Let me take your coat.
Notice
Paul.
how Jean helps her
We're
guests
using
get
my
acquainted.
room. I'll go with you.
Oh, no, never
Well,
mind.
the party is off to a good start. Guests are on time. Everyone's out to have fun and to help others have fun. And when all the guests have arrived and have been introduced, the games begin. Well-planned, well-chosen games. First, a simple get-together game. Each one may ask questions and try to guess his own identity. This mixes the group well, and besides, it provides a means of choosing partners for the next game. Having fun together makes a party. This means both hosts and guests. Whenever any of the guests begin to lose interest in a game, the host should start a new game, so fun together can continue. And, of course, the guests have a part in this, too. Each one should try to make the games fun. Each should take part in what the group is doing.
Ironically, in the nation that touted itself as the champion of individuality and freedom, Americans strove to fit in. But this development actually makes sense if we consider it in the context of the Red Scare. The mold that Americans strove for in the 50s, the dad with an office job, the stay-at-home mom, the white picket fence in the suburbs with a Ford in the driveway, the proverbial American dream, well, that was as American as it gets. And as long as you were striving for that version of the American dream, you were less likely to be accused of being a communist. Most Americans didn't realize it, but they were bringing the Cold War with them everywhere they went. Our final big idea today deals with the demographic and social patterns of the 1950s. Thanks to the post-war baby boom, the 1950s witnessed a renewed emphasis on the nuclear family and traditional gender roles. You'll remember that during World War II, gender roles changed dramatically in the name of the war effort. Women went to work in large number and experienced changes in pay, fashion, and self-image. After the war, however, many of those changes faded away. In large part, this was due to the post-war baby boom, a massive spike in births in the decade following the war. The Allied victory in World War II was cause for a huge celebration in the United States, and for lack of better phrasing, that celebration involved the release of a lot of pent-up sexual energy. But that only partially explains the baby boom. For the first time in more than a decade, things were actually looking up in the United States. Young adults in the 1930s had postponed starting a family during the Depression, and then again during the war. But after its conclusion, many felt confident that the time was right to have children. So they did. Because of this influx of children, and because a single middle-class income in the 50s could easily support a family, women settled back into more traditional gender roles. And these gender roles were actively taught and reinforced. In high school home economics classes, girls were taught how to take care of a husband, and popular magazines published good wife's guides that reminded women, among other things, to know their place. Gender norms that we would today find offensive and sexist were commonly depicted in advertisements. And quietly, women suffered sexism and sexual harassment in workplace settings. Without question, the 1950s saw much of the progress women had made in the preceding decades erased. However, the constricted expectations of American women in the 1950s quietly laid groundwork for their liberation in a variety of counterculture and feminist movements to come in the 60s and 70s. Other social developments of the 1950s include early civil rights activities. In 1954, the Supreme Court finally ruled segregated schools unconstitutional. In 1955, the lynching of a 14-year-old boy in Mississippi sparked national outrage and awareness. And in the same year, a young woman named Rosa Parks refused to give her seat to a white man on a city bus in Montgomery, Alabama. We'll be taking a closer look at these developments and more in a later episode. For now, let's return to the big question. Which poses a bigger threat to American ideals? Radical ideology like communism, or the fear of it? The 1950s presents an impeccable case study. To be sure, the United States faced challenges from communists and their allies. During the Cold War, both sides used espionage widely in order to gain an upper hand against the enemy. And the prospect of nuclear war was very, very real. But in the end, the actual infringements of American ideals were committed by Americans. The McCarthy hearings, the suppression of free speech, and even the restrictions on gender norms all fly in the face of the principles that were supposed to set the United States apart from the Soviet Union. The 1950s reminds us that the terrible power of nuclear fission may be matched only by the power of fear. Next time, we'll move into the 1960s and take a close look at another proxy arena of the Cold War, Vietnam. See you then.